I'm so excited to introduce our first speaker of the day, Stephanie von Friedeburg, who's the Senior Vice President of Operations at IFC. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us to kick off this wonderful day of conversations on development finance.
So Adva, thanks for having me. I think the day looks really exciting. I wish I could spend the entire day with you, but I'm in COP, so have to skid off to Glasgow.
Yes, and so that's where I wanted to start. I think all eyes this week are on Glasgow and what's going to happen in COP, and it really will sort of pave the future for a lot of what is going to happen in development finance and may shape institutions like IFC and others moving forward. And so let's talk about climate. Where does IFC stand today on financing fossil fuels, including through intermediaries? How are you looking at what your role is in climate finance? Some have criticized the World Bank Group writ large as being too weak in their climate response and have called upon it to sort of step up. So where do things stand at IFC?
So Adva, I think the world has actually been hit by two twin crises, climate and COVID. And I think the COVID crisis may be the easier one to solve, and the climate crisis and a retracted problem that's going to take us many years to get right. And I'm really hopeful that in Glasgow we can make some progress towards better NDCs, stronger NDCs to get us to a point where we get to 1.5 degrees Celsius. I'm not sure we'll get there, but it's certainly what I'm hoping for. Climate has always been, a big piece of what the World Bank Group has done. But over the last couple of years, I think we've given it even more focus. And we are the largest lender of climate-related projects in emerging markets. Last year alone, the World Bank Group financed $26 billion, and over the last 5 years, $83 billion worth of climate-related projects. But I think that really wasn't good enough for us. Watching how climate is affecting the poorest people, the floods, the famines, the fires that we've seen this year, and just the real understanding that in the next decade, climate could put another 130 million people into extreme poverty, and by 2050 create 200 million immigrants out of their own countries because the climate situation has gotten so dire. So we knew we needed to do more. Our new climate change action plan, which we came out with in October, has really upped our game. We've committed to make 35% of all of our financing over the period fiscal year 21 to 25 climate related. That target we originally set for ourselves by the end of 2030 as part of our capital increase. And we've also agreed to Paris align all of our projects. So I think you're going to see us doing more and more. I think you probably know that we got out of coal in 2010 and have slowly been reducing any investments in upstream oil and gas. So by 2017, all oil and gas upstream projects we've gotten out of. And on very rare occasions, when we look at a country and we kind of go through a cascade or a waterfall and we say to ourselves, the only and last resort for creating baseload. So there's no renewable possibilities. There's no regional power pools they can share with. Will we contemplate gas? And that's really only going to be in the very, very poorest countries and as a transition fuel.
And does that also hold true for funding you're doing through intermediaries? Are you tracking how your intermediaries are using those funds? Because direct financing is one track, but IFC does a lot of financing to financial institutions. So if they're then going and doing coal investments, et cetera, that could still have pretty negative climate impact. So how are you tracking that sort of downstream of your investment through your pipeline?
Yeah, Adva, two ways, and it's a great question. So one of the things that we're leading the MDB group that is going to define what does Paris alignment mean for all financial institutions and intermediaries through which we invest. And we should be unveiling that thinking kind of early November, right after COP. And I think that will certainly help so that we can align our FI portfolio as well as our real sector portfolio to Paris. Second, as you know, we created a new equity strategy, and we will not invest in banks that aren't willing to green themselves and put themselves on a path to reduce all coal investments over a certain period of time. And so we have made very few equity investments in financial institutions as a result. We've also begun to tailor our products. So instead of giving blanket financing to financial institutions, we started to ring fence that financing and say, this particular financing is for green bonds, for example, or creating a green and climate friendly portfolio. This amount of money is for gender and increasing the amount of lending you do to SMEs and women-owned SMEs. So that really helps us, I think, move away from supporting financial institutions and investments in coal.
One other question I wanted to ask, and this is something that when we spoke last January, so nearly a year ago, you said that one of the things IFC was really going to focus on is ramping up adaptation finance. That's an area that we know, particularly in the world's poorest countries, there is a massive gap. We know that there isn't enough financing today to finance those needs, or really to come close to it. So what has IFC done in this year to ramp that up? Is that part of the plan moving forward, and to what degree?
It is a piece of the plan. Adaptation financing is such a small amount of the private sector investment in climate. I think it was about $2 billion last year across the board. So companies so far haven't been thinking about adaptation, but we're really going to try to do two things. To begin to add adaptation to our individual projects. So if we're working on housing, for example, which we're doing a lot of in Africa, where we're working on both the supply and the demand side. So the supply side from construction companies that are building housing, can we build resilient housing that meets some of the adaptation required? So what kind of materials are we using? And are they safe against floods and some of those kinds of things? And then on the other side, to have our financial institutions that are providing the mortgages for these think about green buildings and ensuring that those buildings are built using our EDGE standards, both at the housing level, and now we have a new EDGE standard that we're rolling out for commercial buildings, which will allow whole cities to plan their buildings and to try to make them greener.
Great. Well, we know that the scope of this challenge is immense, so there's no way we can sort of dive deep. I look forward to learning more about what Paris alignment means for IFC as you release some of those standards, and what that means for MDBs more broadly. But I want to turn to the other twin challenge that you mentioned, which is COVID-19, which has obviously been a focus for IFC and the globe over this past year. I know you've done a lot to lead some of those efforts. I guess my first question is, do you think that the IFC has done enough? And what has that response looked like?
So, Adva, I think that we have done more than we have ever done in a financial crisis. But I want to take a step back and really frame what's happened. 100 million people have moved into extreme poverty. 100 million people who now live on less than $1.90 a day. And not only that, but I think that COVID has really laid bare the inequalities that have existed for some time in the world, but has really shown what those are. We've seen women disproportionately harmed. We've also seen, 60% of citizens in the developed world are fully vaccinated, only 4% in the lowest countries. So we did a couple of things, one of which I think we talked about early on, which was our COVID fast track facility. So when we looked at COVID, what we first said is we need to provide as much relief to our existing clients as possible so that we can preserve jobs and preserve companies. So we created this $8 billion fast track facility, which has really been utilized quite extensively. We've done more than $6 billion under that platform to our existing clients. And it was a great thing to have done. But just as we kind of got that off the taxi rank, I think what we started to see was more and more demand for health, global health issues. So PPE, equipment, pharmaceuticals, and ultimately vaccines. So we then put together a $4 billion, what we call our global health platform, to really try to tackle this. And we have been investing in PPE and medical equipment around the world, and also in vaccines. So we've invested in a vaccine manufacturer in China, which is making the Pfizer vaccine, one in India, and a very big one, which I'm very happy about, in South Africa through Aspen Pharmaceuticals, which is making the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And they're going to produce 300 million doses of Johnson & Johnson to make available for the continent. I still think in the medium term, we have a long way to go. We've been working on equipment distribution. So we've partnered with the likes of Philips and GE and some of our financial intermediaries to get MRI and CAT scan materials onto the continent and into some of the smaller clinics, but partnering with the equipment manufacturers to ensure that the leasing companies actually have the capacity to use and to maintain the equipment as it's brought onto the continent. And I think you're going to see us do more and more of this in different countries, specifically in Africa, where we see the need to build health resilience.
So you talked about doing more than you've ever done, but there's a lot left to do. It's a crisis that isn't over, particularly on the African continent, even as some other parts of the world strive to return to some degree of normalcy, and you see high vaccination rates elsewhere. What does IFC's strategy in COVID response look like moving forward to address those, inequalities that we've seen arise? What do you ramp up? How much more spending? You talked about, getting through most of that 8 billion, and I imagine you've done a fair amount of that 4 billion towards global health financing. What does that look like moving forward? How do you not pull back at a time when one might argue that even more financing than what IFC has already done is needed moving forward? And one thing I wanted to ask in that context is also, how is digitization a piece of that? Because we have seen that rise as sort of a critical component to work and to health in this crisis.
So Adva, we're not going to back away. We're going to step into the crisis. Last year, our fiscal year was the strongest year in our history, $31.5 billion of financing we made available. And that was a combination of both short-term and long-term. So we've actually really ramped up our trade finance. And starting into this fiscal year, our trade finance program is already up 20% over what it was a year ago. So we're going to continue to lean in to the extent that the global health platform or the fast track facility are fully utilized. We will go back to our board and seek approval to make more of that funding available. And then as other ideas come along, so this health platforms that we're starting in Africa, to really tackle the medium term, working with Institut Pasteur to see if we can create an mRNA vaccine manufacturing facility on the continent, continuing to expand some of the economic zones where we can do pharmaceuticals and other types of necessary support functions, sterile saline solutions, needles, vials, all those kinds of things. We're going to continue to push very hard in that space. But so I would say if there was a silver lining in COVID, it was digital, but I say that with some level of hesitancy. So I think we've been able to put people online. We've seen our companies that are e-commerce related companies and fintech companies doing extremely well as a result of the COVID crisis. But I couch that in saying that there are 3.6 billion people who don't have access to the internet. So again, we're going to go back to the notion of inequality. There were 1.6 billion children out of school, Adva, and 450 million of them did not have access to the internet, which means many of them are never coming back, and most of those will be girls. So that's an entire generation lost.
Yeah, and so we have just about a minute and a half, 2 minutes left here. And there's a lot more that we can talk about on COVID as well. But I wanted to get your perspective as we, lead into this day about how development finance is changing. And, I'm sure you've watched, as I have, sort of the growth of ESG and interest in capital markets in some of these issues. And so how do you see the development finance landscape and who's a part of that changing? And how does that also then change IFC's role?
Yeah, Adva, so I actually think that IFC sits in a really unique position right now. We know as a result of the COVID crisis that there's just not enough fiscal space left. Governments cannot afford to do development on their own. And the call from every corner of the earth is the private sector needs to step in and do more. And that's really what IFC does best. But in order for us to do that, I think we do have to change a few things. So first of all, I think we're going to have to partner really differently. We're going to have to think of public-private partnerships. We're going to have to leverage things like philanthropy. which has made money available. And we're going to have to find ways to bring the private sector into development finance. And that's not an easy thing to do. I mean, we hear about all the patient capital that's parked on the outside, but it's going to take innovative platforms that have been adequately de-risked with the right blended finance to actually make that happen. And I think the other piece that's super important, which speaks really strongly to IFC 3.0, which was the strategy we started before COVID, is really building out the projects. There aren't enough bankable projects in the world today, and especially in the world's poorest countries. And so our whole IFC 3.0 strategy is really about creating those bankable projects and then using our different platforms. So our MCPP platform, our EGO fund, our Regio fund, to use capital markets instruments to attract, domestic resource mobilization.
Absolutely.
There's huge things we can do.
Yeah, and I've written quite a bit about that and about your upstream work, so people can learn more about that at Devex. And I'm sorry that our time has come to an end, but Stephanie, I wanted to thank you so much for joining us and for kicking off this day, and good luck at COP, and look forward to hearing what those discussions will hold.
Well, Adva, thank you very much. And again, have a great day. I wish I could be there. It's going to be a very exciting day for you all. So enjoy.
Thanks so much.
Bye.